All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome again to that word chat. Great to see you all. Great to have Jesse Sheidlower back on the show. Jesse was here on one of the early episodes during the COVID days of yore. And we talked about the F word then. And we should say, before we get started, there may be some strong language in this episode. In fact, there definitely will be some strong language in this episode because we're talking about the F word. This is the latest edition, the fourth edition, which is has a whole bunch of new stuff in it. And also, we want to talk to Jesse about since he was on the show, we had he's given us the historical dictionary of science fiction, which is an online resource. Another dictionary based on historical usage and citations and such. But we'll let him explain this. Jesse, welcome back. Nice to see you
Mark,
again.
thanks for having me. Good to be back under better circumstances.
Yeah, somewhat better circumstances, I suppose. But well, I mean, I was just saying, I after last week, I happened to have a little vacation scheduled. I was on an island in Lake Erie, and I lost. I thought there was going to be Wi-Fi at the campground. It was mentioned somewhere, but there was none. And I had to actually go to the south side of the island to actually get a signal on my phone. So it was nice to be sort of out in the woods for a little bit. So anyway, so the new book is the F word, which is updated for this is the fourth edition. I realize the first edition came out in 1995, so you've been considering this word, researching this word, living with this word for at least 30 years. What's the state of the word fuck today? Is it a healthy word? Is it
It's in great shape, Mark. It's
yeah?
really doing very well.
Okay.
We're finding new uses for it all the time. I mean, I think I may have had some sense originally, like this is all that's out there, or there will be occasional things, but not that much. But
Hmm.
in fact, and every time I've done a new edition, I've thought, well, there will be some minor updates, and I'll make sure that the recent quotations are all up to date, but there won't be that much. And in fact, there's been a lot every single time. I mean, this time for this edition, I was expecting minor updates, even though it's been 15 years since the last one, and ended up with 150 new entries. Fuck is doing terrific. Everyone's using it. Everyone keeps using it. And this remains a word for our times.
It is interesting to think about the longevity of the word because I mean a lot of slang words come and go. I think we talked before about uh, words dealing with religion,
Mhm.
that have God in them, damn, um, words like that, and also I think we find in other languages those words are the more taboo swear words. But fuck is a word that has been. It's not a slang word that comes and goes, is it? It's like has real staying power.
Well, I think it's an exaggeration. It's a common myth that all slang is fairly evanescent. But in fact, many things last for, once they get a foothold in the language, they tend to last for a long time. And there's also a distinction that can be made that some people make uh, about vulgar language or taboo language as opposed to slang proper, where certain taboo terms in various categories, including sexual terms, scatological terms, racial terms, should be regarded as taboo or vulgar, let's say, but not slang, which will give it an excuse to last longer in the language than they otherwise might.
Hmm. Okay, interesting distinction. Yeah. Uh, so with 150 new entries, are most of those new or sort of old usages that sort of flew under the radar?
They vary. I mean, there are quite a lot that are genuinely new. There are a number of things that are much older that either flew under the radar or I didn't have much evidence for them, or I just had more. So one of the big changes for this edition, in terms of the research, was further availability of full text online databases, and in particular, the Internet Archive is just a phenomenal resource for all this stuff. So there were many entries that that I, for instance, combined several senses or combined parts of speech. I would have a noun and a verb together because I didn't have much evidence. And now I was able to find enough evidence that I could really split them up and have separate entries, separate senses for a number of different parts of speech, or separate senses, the things that were combined into one big sense. I could separate into more narrowly divided senses. So a number of them came from that were older, and I just didn't have the evidence, and now I do.
Mhm. Um, so the Internet Archive is what is that? Is that synonymous with what we call the Wayback Machine,
Well, the Wayback
or is
Machine
it
is
different?
part of the Internet Archive.
Okay.
The Internet Archive has very many different aspects, and some of which are under legal threat right now because they made in copyright books available for lending in a way that was felt, well, has been held to be not appropriate. But
Mm.
for now at least, they have an enormous amount of material, including scanned versions of copyright books from libraries and manuscripts and TV commercials and early sound recordings and really anything you could imagine, including a very large archive of the history of the entire World Wide Web, which is known under
Right.
the term the Wayback Archive. But it includes very much more than that. And while the search engine is somewhat finicky to use, uh, well, I spent the time on it, so.
Yeah, I mean, and that probably differs from when you were working with the OED. Well, of course, it wouldn't have existed necessarily back then, or I mean, you had electronic resources, but this is sort of a new way of doing lexicography, isn't it?
Well, they're growing all the time. I mean, we have had, since the 1960s, there have been electronic resources that have been used for lexicography, and they get better all the time. They get more extensive all the time. For the first two editions, I didn't have that much. I mean, there were a number of quotations from Usenet sources, for example, but not really that much in terms of full text databases. The big difference for the third edition, which came out in 2009 and was the first one published by Oxford University Press, then we really did have a pretty big range of electronic resources to use. But there is so much more now. I mean, the two main things I would say: the Internet Archive itself, which contains so much, but there have also been a few online archives devoted to Victorian erotica, which have been just enormously
Hmm.
useful for this. And
Yeah.
and several other databases that cover history of homosexual publications, both erotica, actual pornography, and uh, just more serious literary writings, or historical writings about homosexual matters. And these have also just enormous amounts of material that I've been able to use to push back dates for things, to cover things that were not covered at all. So it's been good, and of course, as time goes on, more and more things will be digitized, and it will allow us to have an even better understanding of the history of this and all words.
Right, right. I suppose those publications are not just partly because of the subject matter, but also because they are publications that are by nature underground. They're not mainstream publishers who are finicky about using the word, so they're free to use the F word, throughout their publications. Which, sorry, go ahead.
Well, yes. I mean, the difficulty of researching this word is that, for most of its history, it has not been acceptable to be published in print form. So you have to look at places that have different kinds of material. And one of the sources, and this has always been the case with this book, legal records are a great one for it. Uh, it turns out that if you use the word fuck in a context that brings legal, that brings government authority to bear, and it's part of a case, it will get written down. So several of the earliest American examples are from court cases where someone used the word fuck, and that was part of the case. And it got written down, and now we know something about the attitudes in the 19th century because the court specifically talked about how common it is, even though it couldn't be written down normally.
Hmm, interesting. And it seems like I was just reading the intro and other things I've read. If you go back 50 years, you're really it's a different sort of attitude. It's kind of it's becoming less taboo, isn't it, in publications now?
Absolutely, it's becoming much less taboo over time. And again, when you're looking at earlier times, you have to look at different kinds of sources. Now, when things get any kind of foothold, I mean, there are very few places that won't print it nowadays. It's been on the front page of the New York Times by now, in the mouth of Donald Trump. Um, it's been all over, and of course, still the more formal sources are not going to use it in as wide a range of ways. But the taboos are much lower now than they ever have been.
Yeah, right. They seems like they use it when they're really sort of forced into it, but otherwise we still get the New York Times, of course, is famous. Somebody could write a book on euphemisms in the New York Times, and some of them very creative.
Well,
Um,
and I've written for the New York Times, criticizing their shyness about this. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that they should print things that are not appropriate, but there are very often cases where there is an entire article based on the use of offensive language, and the Times will not print it. And I think this is, I mean, I argue, this is, a dereliction of your journalistic duty. I mean, if you don't want to write it, that's one thing, but to have an article that dances around the topic, you don't even know what the article is about because they don't want to print the word, I think that's a genuine problem.
right, right. And I suppose it's reasonably safe to assume everybody knows the word when they do put a euphemism in there.
Of course. I mean, of course, you don't know that's actually sorry. It's not the case. In fact, I mean, there have been several times when the Times has used euphemisms that I can't tell, and I think I'm pretty much an expert on this. I can't tell what the word in question is because they're being so vague.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, anyone, any educated adult speaker will know these words, and being that coy about it really doesn't serve anyone.
Hmm. We have a couple of questions from the room, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat inquiry, and we'll get to them. One one question we have in Melissa from Melissa Hellman. She says she has no mic today, so I'll read it for her. Is the word fuck ever going to come out? She just didn't want to say the word, I think. Is the word fuck ever going to come out of the realm of the taboo? Has that happened to other words in the past? Or has it been taboo and then now we're in common usage?
Well, there are many words like that. I mean, as you alluded, Mark, uh, one of the things I like talking about is how different kinds of vocabulary change over time. So there are certain subjects that are now not considered very taboo. For example, religious blasphemy, or terms insulting one's parentage, like let's say bastard or whoreson from King Lear. Where these terms in this category were once very extreme. You were not allowed to print them, and if you look at 17th century sources, words like this would have been written with dashes in the place of vowels. The same way sexual terms are now.
Mm-hmm.
And now these terms are much, much, much less taboo. I never want to say anything like this is okay. I'm not saying anything about these are okay or good or whatever. I'm just saying that for most speakers, terms in these categories are not really that bad. And at the same time, you have things that go in the other direction. So slurs broadly considered, racial terminology, terms and talking about people based on their religion or national origin. These are very, very, very much more taboo than they ever used to be. Where even 50 years ago, words, racial terms were in relatively common use, even in mainstream publications, and now they're completely taboo. You cannot say these terms. Um, Now, it is true that sexual and scatological language has been largely considered taboo for most of their history and continue to be regarded that way. But they are becoming less taboo over time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that they will continue to retain some punch. Like I will not say that, oh, it will always be completely, or that at some point soon it will be completely acceptable to say words like fuck or shit in any context. I don't think that's true. Um, and in particular in their literal contexts, referring
Right.
to actual sex acts or actual excretory functions, these will maintain their taboo for a long time. But in figurative contexts, which are how they're most often used, they will become, I think, increasingly less taboo.
Hmm. There are there regional differences? I'll if I go to New York City, I'll hear it a lot more than I will, or actually along the Eastern Seaboard, it seems to be much more common than here in the Midwest or in the middle of the country. Is that is it is it? Are you noticing that it's become less taboo in certain areas, but it still retains something in others?
Yes, there are. There are certainly big national differences. I mean, it's been a truism for a century that the Australians are particularly free in their use of various kinds of offensive language. And there are words in British English that are considered much more offensive than they are here, and to some extent vice versa. But yeah, we're becoming increasingly more able to study this. Jack Grieve, for example, has done a lot of work on
I'm sorry,
using
Jack.
Jack Grieve in England, using geotagged Twitter postings
Mm,
to uh, analyze very, very accurately where different kinds of offensive language are used. And I can send you links later, but he has these, beautiful heat maps of how common
mm,
or uncommon different offensive languages around the country. And yeah, I mean, some things are sort of what you might expect. There's less sexual and scatological terminology in the Midwest. The blasphemous terms are less common in places with stronger religious attitudes than the big coastal cities, let's say. So it does vary, and we're becoming more and more able to study this accurately than we ever have been able to before.
yeah, right. Yeah, I'd love to. This probably isn't fair, but I'd love to get your sort of to draw a graph of the tabooness of the word and where you see it in 10 years and in 20 years. I mean, are we gonna? Is it gonna be like damn in your lifetime?
Uh, probably not that probably not that mild, but it will be again increasingly more acceptable. I mean, I don't know that you can put numbers on it because everyone is different, every place is different. But we've certainly in the 30 years since the first edition came out, the taboo has increasingly been falling.
Yeah, interesting. We have two questions from Kate Karp. I don't know if they were both serious questions, but uh, but
Well, it's
Kate,
hard to be serious when you're when you're
discussing.
discussing fuckery. But I my first was have you done ngram searches of usage of situational usage of the word fuck, say during the election season from both sides? And the other question was, have
Well,
you
let's
also?
get to that question
Yeah,
first.
okay,
I mean,
alrighty.
that is, I mean, it's an interesting, um, yeah, I don't know if ngrams is that exacting, but there are ways to sort of chart the usage of this word over time.
There are different ways. I mean, it was not specifically relevant to this book, so I was not doing
Mhm.
that kind of study. There are people who've looked at the use of this kind of terminology in election context or other contexts over time, but it's not something that I was primarily focused on for this. So that's not what I was looking at exactly.
And
Okay,
your
and
second
my other
question,
question was, have does your book also cover kind of sanitized or disguising ways of saying fuck, such as spelling it oddly or
hmm,
a similar sound, or the way we have to put hashtags in the vowel on social media so as not to be thrown into prison for it or
I cover well, I cover some of that. So, the book is devoted to the word fuck itself and not to euphemistic synonyms. So, for example, you don't have things like screw in there. But I do include words that are basically words that begin with F, or in the case of motherfucker, words that begin with M, that are, very clearly euphemistic, that it's not just a synonym, but, something that really is standing in for that word. So I include things like that, and I do have discussions of various forms of euphemistic avoidance, such as, the history of using dashes, which is from the late 17th century, to replace vowels and things like that, or certain different treatments in certain languages or certain variants of language. So, Northern English "fook" or Irish "feck," for example.
That's great. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's is this, I think this might be a new one, I'm not sure, maybe not. The XXXX.
That was in there before, and that's a different kind of thing. And in fact, it was a little bit hard to figure out how to treat this. So this is an entry late in the book for XXXX, which is pronounced 4X. And this derives from a 1980s advertising campaign for Castlemaine 4X, which is an Australian brand of lager beer, although this is primarily a British rather than an Australian term. And it had the tagline, Australians wouldn't give a XXXX for any other lager. And as a result of this ad campaign, the use of 4X's, or, XXXX pronounced 4X, became something of a thing in British English. So, examples I have are, it was foolish to expect them to give a 4X for anything else, or, most of the world couldn't give a 4X about it. So these examples come from the 1980s. I do have several bracketed examples in this entry for the actual use of 4X's as a euphemistic graphic substitution for the word fuck. So I have an example, for instance, from 1944, from a military letter of, not giving a XXXX. So this is a different thing, and I do include it in there because it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two different uh, sort of related uses there. Is that like something that was expurgated, or is that somebody wrote that I don't give a XXXX?
I can't tell, actually. I'm not sure there is any way. Well, actually, sorry, no. Uh, in this case, this was a collection of military letters that was published in 2003. So I'd be reasonably certain that the letter itself wrote four X characters. But the second example is from 1963, which was from a Louisiana college college newspaper, which again, I'm sure like it was written that well. I mean, it's from when it was, so it was written that way there.
Yeah. Okay, so and not to like, I didn't expect to spend this much time in the X's, but there's a question from Merrill Perlman
I'm
related
going to
to
leave my
this.
camera off if you want me to start talking. The question is whether the condom brand 4X derives from 4X's somehow.
I don't know. I
Okay,
don't know.
this is one where we're all going to get on and see if we can find the etymology of the condom brand. Um, we have a question from Dana, I believe, next.
We do, and I'll read it on her behalf. She didn't have a camera or microphone. Does the taboo against fuck in the professional workplace constitute yet another form of institutional racism and classism?
Can you clarify the question, please?
In the in the I'll try to do it. In the professional workplace, it's sort of a term that is not necessarily used in polite society and in work environments and professional environments, but it's used in a shop, for instance, or in other situations. And so, is that an example of institutional racism and classism, in that it's sort of a word for not proper people?
I mean, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. You know, it is true that, in what are regarded as professional environments, um, you know, the language that is considered more common among other classes or races is generally not approved of. Um, it depends on how whether you regard that kind of thing as racist or not. I mean, I don't think that disapproving of certain kinds of this kind of language would not strike me as an active example of racism. But certainly in taking certain kinds of speech out of out of acceptable discourse, in general is not a good thing in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of the also, and maybe this can't be categorized as institutional classism, but it does have a history of, um, you get that sort of Anglo-Saxon word, and I don't know if this is an example of that, where we're going back to the institutional classism of the 1100s, but is that something that the reason this word is taboo is because it was of the lower classes and not from the Norman invaders? Or am I just making that up?
Well, not in this case. I mean, the idea. Fuck is not an Anglo-Saxon word, at least in the proper sense. Anglo-Saxon is the language that is now called Old English was once called Anglo-Saxon. The word fuck simply doesn't go back that far. We don't really know its history, that far back. As far as we can tell, it doesn't seem to be one of those words where, the French equivalent was the fancy word in the English, the native English word was the common word, and that word then became inappropriate, which we do see in a number of areas. That doesn't seem to be the case here. The evidence all throughout the early period, as far as we can tell, is that this was not an appropriate word because of its sexual reference, not because of who it was being used by. There are differences with certain other taboo words where you do see that. For example, there are a very few examples of shit in Old English being used as a fairly neutral term, and then it becomes taboo later in the Middle Ages. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, as far as we know.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to keep going to the room. We have another question that relates to this.
Yes, Amy Freshour, if you want to unmute and ask.
There we are. Hello. I was asking about the etymology and when have we first seen this word, and what kind of language did it come from? If it was after the Norman conquest, etc. I just want to know more about where it came from.
Well, this is something that in fact, there have been some recent discoveries that have really shed a lot of light on this. The short answer of where it came from, it is a Germanic word, and that's as far back as we can go. There have been some efforts to connect it to words in other languages, but we know that it's Germanic. We have cognates of it in pretty much all the Germanic languages. The earliest example of this word in any of the languages is in fact the English word fuck. And until fairly recently, the earliest clear example we had was from the late 15th century. And in that example, by the way, it was written in a cipher. That is, each letter of the alphabet was replaced with the one later in the alphabet. The word began with the letter G. So showing that it was already considered taboo at that time. It appears in a poem, and the Middle English word swive, which is the main Middle English word for sex, was also written in the same cipher. So, so even in, let's say, 1475, this was considered a taboo term. But there have been a couple of recent discoveries, in the last, literally 10 or 15 years or so, that shed a bit more light on it. A legal historian, or at least a historian working on legal records from Cheshire, found several examples from 1310 and 1311 of a man whose name, and this is his actual name, was Roger Fuck by the Navel. I'll pause so everyone can laugh because it is in fact extremely funny,
it does
and
seem like somebody just forged this whole thing just to
well,
get that out there.
it seems like some kind of weird joke, but in fact, so this is Roger was convicted of a crime. We don't know what. In fact, we don't have that. Um, but he was convicted of a crime, and the authorities were trying to apprehend him and couldn't find him. So over the course of 7 months or so, there were a number of examples, or 10 months, I think, that there were 7 separate examples of his name in court records saying that they were trying to find him. And his name appears over and over, written several different ways. I mean, there were some slight spelling variants, which is what you expect for the time. But it's not like someone wrote it down once and then moved on. No, like this is how he was being referred to over the course of almost a year. So the question is, what does this mean? Like, is this the same word? There are a number of medieval examples of a word that looks sort of like fuck that is probably a different word. But this one, I think this is our word. I think this is it, and I think it has a sexual meaning. That this means that Roger either, tried to copulate in this way or thought that this is how you copulate. I think that's the explanation. I mean, it's the most obvious explanation, but I think it's the right one. So we've now pushed the history of this word back 150 years before we originally knew it, and that was again a very recent discovery in the last 10 years. There was also a fairly recent discovery a few years earlier than that. That was known earlier, but a place name in the 1370s near Bristol, a place called Fucking Grove, which again would seem to mean, and there are other possible interpretations, but this really does seem to mean a grove where one copulates. And this is a proper name. It was, it appears in a charter. You go up to this rock and then take 20 paces left, and this is a place called Fucking Grove. Like it was, this was not in some kind of scurrilous context. And there are other parallel things. There are places called like Loving Grove or things like that. So that would seem to be the obvious interpretation. There are versions of this name that go on for a few centuries past this. So another 14th century example of something that is probably our word.
Can you do the poem? Can you read us the poem?
It's a little bit hard to do because so the poem it's in what's called macaronic verse. It's a combination of Latin and English. But the main line. So I'm just getting. I mean, I do know this offhand, but I just want to make sure I say it right. But it's basically a poem that is satirizing the monks of this particular abbey in Cambridgeshire, and excuse me, sorry. The basic, the important part reads, non sunt in coeli, quia, that's all Latin. And then we have English words, which are in this cipher, fucant vivis of Haley. So the non sunt in caeli means they are not they, that is the monks, they are not in heaven, quia, because they fuck the wives of Ely, this town in Cambridgeshire. So, the fuck word, and it's actually fuckant, the ANT is a pseudo-Latin third person ending. So, of course, some people have a problem with it for that reason. Like, this isn't an English word, but no, this is clearly a joke based on the English word. So the English word fuckant is actually spelled GXDDBOV, which is to say FUCCANT, fuckant. So that's that late 15th century example.
I'm so grateful.
So that's the late 15th century. It seems like your other two examples, the two earlier examples, are words where it wouldn't seem particularly taboo. Yet this clearly is a hidden word. So can we say that something changed in those few decades?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, proper names of various kinds are sort of different category from regular vocabulary. So the OED, for example, does not include, even if there are things that are perfectly clear, does not include place name evidence in actual dating of words. They would mention it in the etymology, but it wouldn't count. Um, it's possible that these 14th century examples might not be our word. It's possible that the taboo was less strong at that time and it only became more taboo, past the 14th century. There are a number of different possibilities. Um, you know, including the fact that no, these were very vulgar, but they just did stick around. Um, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion. So a number of the early examples, 16th century, let's say, it was relatively common in Scots. And, people have argued, well, perhaps it's, of Nordic origin, because Norse influence in Scots English or Scots was, bigger than it was in Southern English. It could just be that the taboo was less strong in Scotland. So, it's possible that these examples are, we're just lucky to have them, and it in fact was very taboo, or several different possibilities, really.
Okay. So let's stick with that. The new edition has 150 new entries. Is that correct? And then
about that, yes.
A whole bunch of antedatings. What are some of the more interesting new words that we should go to the dictionary? If we want to look at dirty words, we go to the dictionary and look them up today.
I mean, quite a variety, of course. I mean, there are 150, fuck around and find out one of our big political terms nowadays. That's one of the newest. That's one of the newest in the whole book.
That seems very fresh. Is that?
That's genuinely, very new. One that I'm very fond of for this edition is the group of expressions of the sort, to give no fucks, or zero fucks given. Things in that family, which, it's sort of hard to define and hard to figure out, how to categorize that. But these go back, if you want to look at it in the way that I choose to, the earliest example is from actually Philip Larkin in the 1940s. Yeah. The social game Fuck, Marry, Kill, I decided to put that in. Fuck ton, meaning a large amount of. Quite a number of initialisms or abbreviations that are typically associated with online communications, such as, AF as a post-positive for as fuck, cool AF,
Right.
FFS for fuck's sake, or FML, fuck my life. An entry that I was particularly, no, sorry, I know I'm not supposed to be reading the chat, but RTFM was already in previous editions, although there was an anti-dating. I think in the last edition, I had an example from 1985, and now I found one from 1972. So that's an example of an anti-dating.
I'm sorry. What is RTFM?
Read the fucking manual.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Several new senses of fuck with. So, for example, fuck with meaning to enjoy or appreciate. I really fuck with that. I really like that a lot.
Yeah, that was new to me. I haven't, which would surprise me hearing it for the first time. But it just means casually like that. That's something I do.
Yeah, and there are several related things to that. There were three new senses three sub-senses that I put into one main sense for fuck with in these sort of closely related but distinct uses, and I particularly like those. And yeah, I mean, RTFM was one anti-dating. There were, quite a number of others. I mean, the expression for fuck's sake, which was previously first recorded in 1943. We now have an example from 1922. Fucked meaning crazy. That was completely fucked. From 1971, we moved it back to 1951. Fuckload meaning a large amount of, from 1984 to 1970. And quite a number of sexual terms that been able to push back almost a century in many cases, because of some of these databases I mentioned of Victorian erotica. So I don't want to say any of these out loud, maybe, but things going back from the 1950s to the 1860s or the 1970s to 1899, which is great. I mean, it's very important actually finding things this early. I mean, it really shows that what we thought we knew about the history of this word was not true.
Right, right. I'm curious. There are so many sexual terms. There are so many words that maybe straddle the line, and then there are so many things that are clearly non-sexual. It's just used as an intensifier. WTF? It means nothing. There's no sexual connotation there at all. Is that something that is maybe more recent? And is there a time, like, can you say that in 1852 was the first time we ever used it in a non-sexual way, and since then it just exploded?
Well, in fact, yeah, this is one of the most interesting things I find about the entire word. There's a sense now everyone thinks that, fuck is a sexual term. It originates that way, sure. But in fact, right now, the most common uses by far are all non-sexual. Excuse me. If you look at corpora, online, not necessarily online, but I mean, actual collections of language that you can analyze. Of how language is actually used, the sexual senses are really not that common. And these are all, or almost all, relatively recent, by which I mean, let's say, post 1900. The example of figurative uses of fuck, before 1900 are very, very, very few. And I don't mean senses, I mean examples at all. A half a dozen total. So something like fucking is an intensive, which is perhaps the single most common use of this word at all. The earliest completely clear example we have of this is from 1893, where it is said to be common. I mean, this was in a dictionary, a Victorian slang dictionary, and it was said to be common, but it was that late. I mean, I do have an example from the 1850s that I think, or 1860s, that I think is real, but it certainly can't. It doesn't seem like it was extremely common. Um, uh, to be fucked, meaning to be doomed. There's one example from the 18th century, and then we skip 100 years forward. And many of them don't come around until World War I or World War II. So, really, even though it is true that right now fuck is not primarily a sexual word, all of these non-sexual senses seem to be pretty recent. In the history of the word, that is, 100 years, 150 years.
Right. I was surprised that the fuck with,
Mm-hmm.
in the literal sense, is new in the fourth edition, which I read. And if you
Well,
have a chance, Nancy Friedman in the Strong Language blog wrote about this, the new entry of fuck with, and also has a Q&A with you, which is really good reading.
right. Well, if I can explain the decision behind that, I mean,
Yeah.
to fuck with in the literal sense, this is what you would describe as non-lexicalized. That is, if fuck with does not have a specific meaning. This is just fuck plus with. And it would be the same thing as if you said, used fuck on to refer to a surface on which one copulates. That doesn't mean that fuck on has a specific sense. If you said, they fucked on the couch or they fucked on the bed or something like that. That's just the usual use of this verb with a preposition. So the example of the literal use of fuck with that I put into this edition, it's not because it wasn't common or I hadn't encountered it. It's because this is non-lexicalized. Like, this is just fuck and with. And the reason I put it in this time and didn't put it in previous editions is that the entry for fuck with expanded so much that I thought, well, I really should put it in here just to show how early this is, and and that there was this other sense, um, and I do have a note saying, this is non-lexicalized, so it really doesn't belong in. Like, in general, for dictionaries, you don't put in something like that, with a definition, because that's just a natural function of how the language works.
Mm-hmm. Right. So under fuck, you would have a definition that means mess with, basically, or um, you know,
Well, fuck
the
with
negative.
meaning, fuck with um, was in that sense, yeah, to mess with either maliciously or playfully. These are two different senses, so that was in previous editions. Um, uh, because that is something that's very specific about fuck with as a compound. But that's different for that fuck with and fuck with meaning to have sex with.
Hmm. Okay, so right. Okay, are there other examples of that where I'm sure there are hundreds of decisions where you say should I do this or not? Are there other examples of that maybe
Well,
are
well, many of the examples of fuck with a preposition would work like that. Fuck off, doesn't really have a literal sense, but one could imagine, I'm sure one could concoct one, or one could find an example of fuck off, you know, in some literal sense, like to fall off a bed during sex or whatever. But those aren't included. I mean, fuck off has several senses that are included in the book, and those are the ones that are defined at the entry for fuck off. So uh, that's how that kind of thing would work.
okay. I can get into the weeds. I'm very interested in the lexicographical process and the ways that this differs from others. Like because I know and we haven't even talked about the science fiction dictionary, so I should get into that. But your background wasn't originally the Oxford English Dictionary. I believe it was Random House originally.
Yeah, I worked for 8 years in the Random House reference department.
Mhm.
And the reason I got into the fuck game in the first place is that I was the project editor for the Historical Dictionary of American Slang, which we published the first two volumes of when I was at Random House.
Ah,
Um, and the original edition of the F word, which came out in 1995, so the first edition, the first volume of HDAS, the Historical Dictionary of American Slang, came out in 1994. And I thought, this is a very large, a very fiscally large and expensive, academic kind of book. Um, and I thought, most people are going to turn right to F. Like they're all going to want to look this up. This is the fun thing about it, right? And I thought, we should put this out as a separate book. And I thought, I can't say like this would be ridiculous if I actually suggested this. So for 6 months, I didn't say anything about it because I thought it would be laughed out of the editorial meetings. And finally, we had some meeting, and there was nothing else interesting going on. And I finally said, "What if we took the F word stuff out of the slang dictionary and published that as a separate volume?" And everyone said, "That's great, great idea." So okay, and that's how it arose. Uh, yeah,
okay.
so that was the start of my career in lexicography, was at Random House.
Any regrets that suggesting that at that meeting?
No, I mean, I think it was. I mean, the thing I like about this word is that people are very interested in it, and it is something that until very recently has not been able to be studied academically. You were not allowed
Yeah.
to work on things like that. I mean, that's been changing for a few decades now, where not just linguistically, but in general, the study of popular culture, broadly conceived, has been not really acceptable in academia. That's completely changed now, but in the 1990s, there weren't really good treatments of this kind of language because it's something that was not considered acceptable for linguists to work on.
Mhm. Okay.
And getting that out there, yeah, I have no regrets at all. I mean, everyone wants to know more about this, and being able to help do that is a good thing.
Right. So then you went to the OED, and this and the historical dictionary of science fiction. I hope I have the title right.
Yeah.
Um, it they both owe a lot to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Is that right?
Well, first of all, they're both historical dictionaries. So, a historical dictionary, for anyone who doesn't know, is a dictionary. The OED is the best known one, and what it means is that for a historical dictionary is that for every sense of every word, you will include quotations from literature broadly conceived, from usage, showing how this term has been used, traditionally from the earliest to something that's relatively recent. So, if you look up a word, common, rare, whatever, you will see that this was first used in the 1670s, and here's an example from every 50 years from then until now. And you can see how something has been used. You can see how it's changed. You can see what, when sense is developed. And this is how historical dictionaries work. And there are historical dictionaries devoted to different time periods. You have the Middle English Dictionary. You have historical dictionaries devoted to different kinds of English. So the Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue versus the Scottish National Dictionary versus the Dictionary of New Zealand English versus the Australian National Dictionary. You have historical dictionaries devoted to specific subjects, like the Historical Dictionary of Golfing Terms. And there are all sorts of things out there, and historical dictionaries in various other languages as well. So both the F word and the Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction are historical dictionaries, meaning that they include quotations, showing how words are used.
Right. So tell us tell us about that. That was 2021, it's an online, it's there online. I assume it's a living dictionary that's being updated and
It is.
added
I'm updating it all the time. So this is again Historical Dictionary of Science Fiction, and this grew out of a project that I started when I was at the OED. That was originally not intended as a dictionary itself. It was basically crowdsourcing research on science fiction, and this started in 2001. And the idea was that the OED has always been a crowdsourced dictionary, by which I mean the OED reached out to people saying, help us study, help us research the language, read things and send in interesting words to us. From the very earliest days of the OED, that's how it worked. And one of the things we wanted to do in the more modern era was, use various online resources, online communication to be able to do this more easily, to be able to show what we're looking for, and to be able to share that back. That is, when people would send things in, we would put those online so other people could see them, not just have to wait 50 years for a new edition of the dictionary to come out. And we had a pilot project devoted to the language of science fiction, partly because, in 2001, people were less online than they are now, and people who were into science fiction would be more online and better at that. Also, science fiction is relatively limited in scope. That is, to find the vocabulary of science fiction, you read science fiction. You don't have to read the entirety of everything that could be out there in the language as you would for, let's say, political terms. You read science fiction texts to find science fiction words. And those texts themselves were until recently not really easily available. Libraries, research libraries did not collect that kind of thing because it was considered inappropriate. So pulp magazines, where the core of science fiction appeared in the middle of the 20th century, major research libraries, even the big, Library of Congress, New York Public Library, the Bodleian, wouldn't have these at all because they didn't think it was worth collecting. So the way to get this is by, having private collectors, science fiction fans who had them, and look there. So for all these reasons, we started this project, focusing on science fiction, having language that we didn't have access to or didn't necessarily know about, and had a website where we would say the first word that we were studying was the word mutant, meaning a person with different and especially special abilities. And the earliest example we had in OED was 1954, which we knew was late. And an OED researcher posted a question about it in a Usenet discussion group, and pretty quickly found an example from 1938, which was a big difference. Great, let's do this as a thing. So that project ran for, in earnest for a couple of years, a number of years, and eventually a dictionary came out of that. So it was run by several moderators. I mean, I supervised it for OED, but the day-to-day running was being done by several moderators. And one of them, Jeff Pruker, compiled the entries into a book, into a historical dictionary called Brave New Words, which ended up winning the Hugo Award for, in 2008, I think 2007, for best related work. And then during a few years after that, the project more or less went dormant, partly because by the time the book came out, people felt like, well, we've done a pretty good job already. And then when I left, and it was tied to OED databases. So when I left the OED in 2013, it became impossible for me to update updated anymore because it severed my access to OED databases. So nothing happened for a long time, even though there was still a lot of useful information out there. And in 2020, when the pandemic started, there were two things that had changed. One was that I was stuck at home and had a lot of time, and the other thing was that the Internet Archive, as we've talked about in the very start of this, had digitized a very large collection of pulp magazines. So in fact, we didn't need to rely on individual collectors reading through issue by issue to find things. Basically all mid-century science fiction was out there in a database. So it would be possible not only to, that I could personally do this from my desk, but you can find pretty much everything. And so basically, I spent a year, turning that into, from a citation gathering database into a real dictionary. And that's what we have now. And since it launched in early 2021, there have been, several hundred new entries added and all sorts of features that I find particularly useful. So, many of the quotations, most of them by now, are linked to their original sources. So if you look up mutant, you can click on any of the quotations and go to the Internet Archive and see the actual page image of the place where it first appeared. And this is the kind of thing that I think will be happening more and more with historical lexicography. I mean, already there have been interest in this kind of thing where, you look in OED and you find an example of something from Shakespeare, and well, you click a button and you end up with the full text of Shakespeare and the original, the first folio, whatever. And bringing these things together is something that's useful, I think, for all kinds of language research, and that's basically what the HDSF is.
Yeah, that's exciting. I wanted to ask you about, I wanted to mention one thing that's happened. We talked about two episodes ago, and then it came up again unexpectedly the last time. So I need to ask you about it because it relates, and that's a new entry in the OED for the Australian term, no walking furries.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a play on, no fucking worries.
Yeah.
Is this, so of course, when I got it, I immediately looked for what is not there. So
yeah, well, no walkers is one of the main uses, in fact. In the same sense, no worries. I did hear about that. I discussed it with an Australian linguist I know. I thought it wasn't, I didn't quite have enough evidence. But I am aware of it. It's on the list for future things. I did put one there are several Australians, and there's one new Australianism in here, which is the expression, we're not here to fuck spiders.
Yeah, what does that mean?
It means we're not messing around. We're being serious.
Yeah.
We're not here to fuck spiders. And in fact, there are several interesting early examples of that as well. Fuck spiders, meaning, fuck off, go to hell. The earliest example of which is actually from T.S. Eliot, the absolute last person you can imagine using something like this. But there was recently Christopher Ricks edited a collection of some of T.S. Eliot's juvenilia, which includes some obscene things, and it appears there. And there are several other early examples in this meaning of fuck spiders, meaning fuck off. Go to hell before we see the Australianism, here to fuck spiders.
Right.
So I do make an effort to include, uses of this word from non-American and English sources. There are a handful of new ones from around the world, specifically regional ones from around the world in here.
Okay. Well, and so we can hope for a 5th edition to keep adding to it.
No walkers will be in there. If people keep using it, it'll definitely be in. Yeah.
Right. And are you getting, do you get a lot of submissions from unexpected sources, or do you have or do you do most of the research yourself? Or
no, I've heard of many of these. I've heard of most of these. People do make suggestions all the time, and I hope I do a pretty good job of I hope I haven't made any horrific mistakes. But I know there are very many things that are not in. There are tons of things that are not in. Yeah. Harper's reviewed it 2 weeks ago and pointed out that I did not have an entry for fuck house, which was in some prominent movie where referring to, well, a fuck pad that is a place where a location that one uses for casual sex. And this movie was from 1995, I think. And in fact, I had researched this. I came across it in four different senses, of which fuckpad is the second sense. And I had an example back to 1972. The earliest one is fuckhouse, meaning a brothel, where I had an example from 1965, and then two other senses. But all of these were pretty rare. I mean, I had one or two or maybe three senses for, and they didn't seem to be that common. So I left it out. And of course, you leave it out, and someone reviews you in a big magazine and says, "Oh, you missed this thing." And okay, I mean, I think it was. I don't think I missed it. I think I made the correct decision leaving it out. But it's a real term. It's been out there for decades. You could make a perfectly reasonable argument for putting it in, or that I should do it for future editions, and there we go.
Yeah, and I suppose that's what a lexicographer has to deal with, and if that's the worst criticism, then you're probably doing okay.
Well,
really quick, last time we did the show, we had some technical difficulties. It was lost forever, but we employed your skills as a bartender. I got bumped off. You and Colleen Newvine were here, and you made a Boulevardier, which is what I'm drinking today. Is the threesome toll booth, this underground concept bar in Brooklyn, is this are we gonna see that come back?
I hope we do. So for people who don't know, when I'm not writing dictionaries, I have a side project, as a bartender or bar manager for typically underground events. And for 5 years, 4 years, my colleague and I ran a bar called the Threesome Toll Booth, which was a bar literally in a closet exactly large enough for two people plus the bartender, in the depths of Brooklyn. And we ran that until the first week of the pandemic. I think our last day was May 16th, 2020. March 16th, 2020. And we closed then, and we have not reopened. We have been finally thinking about it now more actively. We have some possibilities in mind, and of course, we could have a very different kind of bar. But meanwhile, it's still something that we look forward to, but nothing now. And in the meantime, we do private events or other things, and I still enjoy doing this, but we do not have a legal public bar that is currently running right now.
Okay. All right. I'm pushing the time. We're over, but we appreciate it. Lots more questions, but it's been a fun hour. Great to talk to you again. Great to see you again. The book is The F Word. And I love the new cover with it partially blocked out as we do, but it's always been called The F Word. Fourth edition out a couple of weeks ago, I think, from Oxford University Press. So get that. And thanks for coming. We'll be back in December 12th, I believe, with Amanda Jones. She's the author of That Librarian: The Fight Against Book Banning in America. So our second time we've got a librarian on the show, so that should be a lot of fun. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Thank you.